Hello and welcome to this externally led patient-focused drug development meeting for NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. My name is Donna Cryer. I am the president and CEO of the Global Liver Institute, a nonprofit patient advocacy organization that operates in the United States, the UK, and Europe. I am also a liver transplant recipient and am privileged to be moderating this session today. Since the beginning of the patient-focused drug development program, the elevation of the patient voice and the inclusion in the drug development process, in the regulatory science and value of what patients have lived through with their condition, with their disease, was included in a new way. And hopefully we have seen and will see, based on today, that the medications and treatments that are developed for us really resonate, are relevant to us, are safer and more effective for us, and are medications that we want to take, that we have confidence that we will benefit from, that we understand the side effects and risks of, and that those are ones that we are willing and able to take. To get to that point, strong partnerships with the Food and Drug Administration and with research sponsors and investigators is necessary. And so I welcome all of those stakeholders to this externally led patient-focused drug development meeting today. And so it is my great pleasure and honor to be able to introduce our main partner in this work, Dr. Joseph Turner, who leads the division of hepatology and nutrition at the Food and Drug Administration. This is the division where drugs for NASH are reviewed. So, Dr. Turner, I turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you, and good morning. Really appreciate you inviting us to participate in this meeting, and I would like to thank the Global Liver Institute and the staff that were involved in planning this meeting. I'm approaching my one-year anniversary of being named the permanent director of a newly formed division, the Division of Hepatology and Nutrition. And with the reorganization of the division, I had been the acting director, and so I've been in this position essentially for the past 18 months since March of 2020. And some of you know I had been at FDA for more than 20 years, and I had been involved in review divisions that gave me considerable experience in the accelerated approval process and trial design issues for confirmation of clinical benefit, and also challenges with defining new efficacy endpoints for antibacterial drug treatments for specific infections. So, and I have confidence that we can overcome some of the challenges that face drug development programs for patients with chronic liver diseases, including NASH. We recognize the importance of patient-focused drug development meetings and hearing directly from patients and their caregivers. In fact, we met with parents of children with progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis, PFIC, and although we had already agreed upon a drug development program using pruritus as an endpoint, the input that we received from parents and caregivers of these children only reinforced the appropriate use of a new observational endpoint for treatment of pruritus in PFIC, and as well the related condition of Alagille syndrome. And we approved drugs this summer and early fall based upon success in observational findings of improvement in pruritus based on these new endpoints. And so input from patients and parents was a great help to us in review of these drug development programs. And so for many chronic liver diseases, there are no effective treatments. And for some, the adverse clinical outcomes might not become evident for years or even decades after the diagnosis is established. And this creates challenges in drug development. And further, some other chronic liver diseases are rare, and it also creates challenges in drug development programs. But note that they're not impossible or impracticable. And the drug development programs for PFIC and Alagille syndrome were very small programs, but the trials were prospective, randomized, and controlled trials for a finding of superiority. So very robust finding of efficacy. And we were able to work with the challenges of a small pre-approval safety database, and we're able to work through those. So we look forward today to incorporating what we learn and include this in our thinking and understanding of how patients view benefits and risks of therapies for diseases for treatment of NASH and chronic liver diseases. And your input and perspectives help us and also helps industry and academia to move the drug development process forward and ensure that new medicines become available to meet the needs of people living with chronic liver diseases. And once again, we're here today to hear the voice of the patient, and thank you for your participation. We're grateful to each and every one of you for being here and sharing your stories and experiences and perspectives. So again, thank you, and we look forward to today's presentations.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. It is so exciting to hear that there has been a willingness to speak to a variety of patient organizations representing the diversity of liver diseases and a increased focus on making sure that there are medications, devices, therapies, treatments, ways of addressing the entire spectrum of issues in liver health. We know that chronic liver disease in all of its forms are increasing, and they affect tens of millions of Americans collectively. And unfortunately go on to cause liver cancer, the need for transplant, and are various very serious conditions that require an urgency to address. So I'm overjoyed to hear that you are working in greater partnership with liver health organizations across the board. For today, we will have two panels that feature patient voices. Often the term "the patient voice" is used. There is no such thing. There are more than 100 different types of liver disease, and even within fatty liver disease and NASH, there is a great diversity of experience and perspectives. And so it is our intention to feature as many of those possible today through our panelists and through the questions that we welcome from the audience. And so we will have our first panel that will focus on issues of awareness, education, the impact of NASH. We will then move to a Q&A for this first panel. We will take a break, and then there will be a second panel today that will focus on the path to diagnosis and move towards ideal clinical trial design and barriers to that ideal design and participation. We will have Q&A for that panel, and then we will have concluding remarks and end our day at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. In addition to this session today, this workshop and PFDD meeting today, there is a survey that has been circulating throughout the liver community. I want to thank all of the NASH Council members, all of the members of the AASLD NASH Task Force, and others who have helped to circulate the survey so that we can, at the end of the day, present structured and unstructured data to the Food and Drug Administration and others involved in drug development and regulation from as diverse a spectrum of patients and patient experiences and caregiver experiences as possible. So thank you to everyone who has been contributing to that survey as well. We will have the link to the survey available to anyone who's participated, who's registered for this meeting. If you have not had a chance to fill out that survey, if you're a patient or caregiver, or spread that survey throughout your network, if you are another stakeholder. So with that, I will introduce our first panel, and we will have speaking in this order, Anthony Villarotti, Megan Lazzaroni, John Malachek, and Terry Milton. So I turn it over to my fellow patients. Mr. Villarotti.
I'm Tony Villarotti from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My journey with liver disease began in 2005. I was 59 years old. I was a diabetic and also overweight. I was seeing my doctor every 6 months for my diabetes. After some blood work, he told me that my liver enzymes were elevated and that I had fatty liver. I never heard of that condition, but he didn't make a big deal of it, and so I didn't ask any questions. He told me I should lose weight, but that didn't set off any warning bells, as I heard that at every doctor's appointment. I walked out of that appointment not concerned at all by fatty liver, with my focus continued to be on my diabetes. I continued to see my general practitioner every 6 months. Sometimes he mentioned fatty liver, sometimes he didn't, and I was experiencing no symptoms. In 2014, after an ultrasound and blood work, my doctor told me I had NASH and maybe cirrhosis. I was confused. I never heard of NASH, which is non-alcoholic hepatitis, and I thought that cirrhosis came about because of drug use or alcohol abuse. So I was a non-drinker, so it never crossed my mind that cirrhosis was something I had to worry about. At that point, he suggested I see a hepatologist to confirm his cirrhosis diagnosis. So I did that. And the hepatologist confirmed the cirrhosis diagnosis early in 2015. I began a regular testing regimen, which included blood work and imaging. The testing showed that my liver was continuing to deteriorate. I began to experience a few symptoms, mostly just feeling tired, but my condition was still not having much of an effect on my everyday life. The possibility of a transplant down the road was mentioned, but I didn't seriously consider it. I asked the doctor about a liver biopsy, but she said she didn't think it was a good idea. She described it as looking for a needle in a haystack, and said the imaging tests were just as good and didn't carry any of the risk of a biopsy. In 2017, my world was kind of rocked when I was diagnosed with liver cancer. This was a game changer. I was still not on board about the possibility of having a transplant, but my doctor explained to me that I had two choices. I was either going to get a transplant or I was going to slowly die. Obviously, not much of a choice. So at that point, I underwent the extensive testing that was required to get on the transplant list, and I was approved for the transplant list a few months later. But the risk I faced was that if my cancer spread beyond the liver or grew in size, I would be disqualified from receiving a transplant. My oncologist recommended that I undergo stereotactic body radiation therapy, which entails 5 very targeted doses of radiation over a 10-day period. But it would take 6 months to know whether it worked. The treatment was not a cure, but was intended to stop the growth of the tumor. It was a bridge to transplant. Over the next few months, I began to experience symptoms, and they included fatigue, loss of appetite, nosebleeds, and fluid retention in both my abdomen and in my lungs. My abdomen and lungs had to be drained to remove those fluids. The one bright spot during this period was that the 6 months had passed from my cancer treatment, and radiation therapy had worked. The tumor had not spread beyond the liver and was under control. Within a couple of weeks, though, things took a turn for the worse. I developed hepatic encephalopathy. My liver had deteriorated to the point where it was not removing toxins, and ammonia had gotten in my bloodstream and gone to my brain. One day I had an episode where I didn't recognize my wife, and I didn't know where I was. I was rushed to the hospital and stayed there 5 days while they got my ammonia under control. From that point forward, my brain was foggy, and I had a hard time concentrating and even reading a book. I had to stop driving. I had a second bout of HE, which was more mild, but resulted in another hospital stay. In the middle of December 2016, I reached a 6-month mark of my being placed on the transplant list. Under the rules in place at the time, which have since changed, I received exception points and moved up the transplant list, and I knew I was close to being called. I'm a bad mix of optimism and impatience, and I expected to have my transplant before Christmas. That didn't happen. December turned into January, and January turned into February, and I was still waiting. I'm normally a laid-back and upbeat person, but I was falling apart both medically and physically. Lots of emotional ups and downs. Some days I was convinced I would never get a transplant, and I would work on writing my obituary and letters to my children. Other days, I would convinced I would get a transplant, and I would start planning a vacation after transplant. These ups and downs in my deteriorating physical and medical condition placed a great burden on my wife, who was my caregiver. I'm convinced I would not have survived this if it was not for her efforts. She was truly my angel on earth. Finally, in mid-March, 1 year to the day that I was diagnosed with cancer, I received a call and went off to the hospital for a transplant. The operation was a success, and I was home 8 days later, very weak and still with a little brain fog, but glad the ordeal was over. Looking back on my experience, the thing that struck me the most was how few people had heard of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, despite the fact that as many as 100 Americans have it. And overall, there's a general lack of knowledge about the liver. The survey I saw shortly after my transplant showed that about 1/3 of those surveyed thought you could live without a liver. More recently, I saw a study earlier this year that indicated that less than 7% of the people that have a fatty liver know that they have it. That's scary. My experience suggests that even those 7% of us that know they had a fatty liver don't understand the potential consequences of the disease. I certainly didn't know that, and my experience in talking to others indicates that others are in the same boat. This awareness issue motivated my wife and I to form NASH Knowledge, a nonprofit with a mission of providing education and increasing awareness of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. We did this about 6 months after my transplant. My life had been saved by my transplant, and I felt an obligation to help others from following in my footsteps. Unfortunately, my experience has been that this lack of awareness extends even to many in the medical profession. Just taking my case as an example, I had two of the primary risk factors for fatty liver and cirrhosis. I was obese and I had diabetes. What if the monitoring of my disease had gone beyond the periodic routine blood test and had included non-invasive testing that tracked the severity of the condition of my liver? And what if on the day I was told I had a fatty liver, I was also told that my condition might lead to cirrhosis? I feel strongly that either of those had occurred, I would at least have had the opportunity to control my condition and maybe avoided a transplant. I had 9 years between my fatty liver and cirrhosis diagnosis. 9 years. I had 18 doctor's appointments during that time. But as far as addressing my condition, those 9 years were wasted. My point here isn't to be a Monday morning quarterback and talk about would haves and should haves. But just to point out that we need to do a better job of educating and monitoring those at risk. I would also like to address the lack of a medical solution for those with NAFLD and NASH, particularly the assessment of the safety of the drugs under development. I'm not a scientist and have really nothing to contribute to the medical assessment of drug safety, but I do understand a patient perspective on this subject. We also see TV commercials where the sales pitch for a drug is followed by a list of very scary side effects. The choice is left to the patient in consultation with their doctor to weigh the risk and rewards of that drug. I would encourage the FDA to give NASH patients that same choice when it comes to NASH drugs. Please don't let perfection be the enemy of good. Having no drug for the treatment of NASH is a risk in and of itself. As we sit here, patients are continuing down the road to a transplant or even death. The world is not standing still. I was lucky enough to receive a transplant, and I'm thankful that I did. I wouldn't be alive today without it. But I have to tell you that a transplant is not a great solution. A transplant is not a get out of jail free card. The anti-rejection drugs I'll be taking for the rest of my life have damaged my kidneys to the point where I've lost half my kidney function, and my diabetes has gotten worse. It's a price worth paying, but it'd be much better served if a medical solution had been available to slow down or stop the progression of my condition. Risk is not something that can be completely evaluated sitting in a lab, an office, or a conference room. The patient perception of risk cannot be ignored. It must be part of the discussion. Risk is very situational. I'm sitting here on the second floor of my house. If I got up and jumped out the window, that would be risky behavior, and I would understand that risk. But if my house was on fire and I saw flames in my hallway, that the risk of jumping out my window would not have changed, but all of a sudden it would be a risk worth taking. For many NASH patients, their house is figuratively on fire, and they're willing to take some risk. So I know I'm being repetitive, but I feel like I can't say it enough. Please consider the patient perspective during your evaluations. In summary, I think there are three elements that must work in combination to stop or slow down this epidemic. We have to increase awareness. We have to increase the use of non-invasive technologies for early detection and the monitoring of liver disease. And we have to find medical solutions. I would encourage the FDA to take actions that facilitate each of these elements. Finally, I would just like to thank the Global Liver Institute and the FDA for this opportunity to convey my experience and my thoughts.
Thank you, Tony. Megan?
Hi, my name is Megan Lazarum, and I'm from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. My mother and I grew up in Alexandria, Louisiana, and I am here today because I lost my mother. I read something somewhere that has always stuck with me. Behind all of your stories is always your mother's story, because hers is where yours begin. And what an honor I've had in my life for my story to have started with hers. She taught me you could be kind without being a pushover. She was secretly hilarious. She loved oldies. She loved dogs. She loved fast cars. She was a devoted daughter and cared for her parents until they passed away. She never missed a single dance performance or class party. She would take me through Wendy's for nuggets and McDonald's for fries if I wanted. She was a registered nurse. She was my child's grandmother. She was my best friend, and she was my backbone, and she was diagnosed with NASH. For years, my mother felt unwell. She was often fatigued. And because she was a nurse, she knew something was wrong. She was a type 2 diabetic, and she was overweight. But she continued to go to doctor after doctor. And in Alexandria, being a small town, there just weren't very many specialists. So she ended up traveling all over Louisiana to find someone to correctly diagnose what was going on. They would often tell her she was depressed and just needed to try depression medicine, but she knew she was not sad, she was sick. This was very frustrating, obviously, because it spanned over a decade of her trying to get a correct diagnosis. She found a doctor that she thought was on board, and he diagnosed her with fibromyalgia, which she thought explained a lot of her symptoms. And she, for a while, kind of dove into that. But as she continued to feel worse, she began to feel more fatigued. She lost hair. She had nosebleeds all the time. She went to another specialist in New Orleans, and they told her that it looked like her liver enzymes were elevated, and they asked her if she drank often. And she was a very strict Baptist, and she did not drink at all. So she was offended by this question, but it led her to seek out more treatment. And she went to an oncologist who actually, I think, was the turning point. She felt like she had often been defeated because no one believed she was sick, but this doctor did. And he ran a bunch of tests, and he gave her the diagnosis of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And from there, she was monitored every 2 weeks with blood work and enzymes. And at some point, her white blood cell count remained elevated, but her liver enzymes with lifestyle changes looked like they were improving. And we took that as, great news, obviously. But they quickly changed and began to show that they were worsening. So they recommended a liver biopsy. And that is when they found the severe cirrhosis of her liver and diagnosed her with NASH. I Googled it frantically when she told me about it and asked if I could give her a part of my liver. And she said the doctor did not seem too concerned and that she believed it to be manageable with lifestyle changes. And she began going more often for blood work, and her white blood cell count remained elevated. But she was mostly living a normal life until all of a sudden she wasn't. Her spleen had enlarged by this point, but she was still able to continue her normal day. And one day she was doing her normal thing and she passed out. She did not want to go to the hospital. At this point, I don't believe any of us were connecting, because of our ignorance of the disease, connecting the liver to the problem. It had kind of been so downplayed by doctors and her that we didn't know that that was what was going on. She blamed it on being diabetic and her sugars being off. Later on that day, she passed out again, and we took her to the hospital. I say we, my brother took her to the hospital. I live in Baton Rouge, and so I was a couple of hours away. We drove in, and unfortunately, she bled out internally that day, and they gave her multiple transfusions while we watched through the window, and nothing happened. After it was over, we were all shocked, dumbfounded. I knew she had a liver disease. I knew it was serious, and I knew she was going to doctors for it, but I thought, didn't she say it was treatable? Wasn't she fine? Was this real? We were all so shocked that we had an autopsy done. The autopsy showed that it was an abdominal bleed in her liver and spleen. It also showed her kidneys were in failure and her heart was also failing. And we did not previously know that. I'm not sure if she was aware and did not tell us, but I don't believe so. So this is why I'm here today. I'm here because there isn't a day that goes by that I don't miss her so much. I can feel it in my bones. I'm here because my daughter was only 2 when she passed away, and she will never know how wonderful she was. And I am here because I don't want anyone else to be in this situation. I don't want anyone to be in their early 30s without their mother. I want this disease to be talked about. I want it to have its own commercials. I want people to know that it's not caused by drinking. I want people to know that yes, lifestyle changes can help, but there have got to be some other treatments we can test for before we get to the point of needing a liver biopsy and it being too far gone to help. So my goal in being here today is not only just to honor my mom, but just ultimately that we can get to a point where this is not something that people are dying from. So I really appreciate y'all listening to my story today and my mother's story. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. John?
Thank you. My name is John Mahalchek, and I'm a chronic illness patient and a patient advocate, and I live here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Before I get into my story, I just wanted to thank Team GLI for giving me this opportunity, to the FDA and industry representatives for being in attendance to listen to our stories. But most importantly, to my fellow advocates and panelists, not just for the work they did preparing for this event, but for the work they do year-round to improve the lives of patients with chronic liver disease. So for my story, I like to start out by saying NASH, like most other GI conditions, is not a cookie cutter condition. The paths that we as patients take to get diagnosed are almost always unique, and the disease itself can be unique from patient to patient. So my story starts back in 2006. I was a freshman in college, just finishing up my first semester of my freshman year, getting ready for finals, and I experienced a severe bout of abdominal pain with nausea and vomiting, and had to go down to the emergency room. Considering the timing with it being close to finals, my first time having finals and being in college, they thought that this was probably most likely related to stress. So they said just to take it easy, and they sent me home. About 48 hours later, I was called back into the hospital because my liver enzymes were elevated, and they also found out that my gallbladder had to be removed. So we did that. We thought it was like a one and done thing. You know, my gallbladder needed to come out. My liver enzymes went up, but they said that wasn't a really big deal, that it was probably related to the gallbladder. So, you know, we all thought that would also be where my story ends. But unfortunately, it wasn't. I would continue to have these episodes of severe abdominal pain every couple months. And this time with my future episodes, not only would my liver enzymes go up, but also sometimes my pancreas enzymes would go up. And we were kind of at a loss as to what was going on. I was having issues maintaining weight, and I was having a lot of issues just functioning in general. The pain was very severe. I was constantly nauseous. So in 2011, we decided to try placing a feeding tube. The goal being that we would kind of let my digestive system rest and let everything try to heal on its own. Unfortunately, this didn't really help much, and we found that my pancreas had been atrophying this entire time. So in 2013, I underwent what's called a total pancreatectomy with Autoisla transplant. So basically what they do is they go in, they take my pancreas out, they take all of the insulin producing cells that live in my pancreas, and they put them into my liver. So now my liver is doing double duty, right? It has to function as a liver, but it also now is functioning as a pancreas. I was in the hospital for about a month recovering. And during this recovery, I had to be placed on TPN. TPN is when they put a special catheter right in the tip of your heart, and they use it to infuse nutrition if you're not able to eat. So I would get, you know, fats and lipids and vitamins and sugars and everything that I needed to sustain myself would be injected right into my heart, and we would do that every day. Now, being on TPN puts patients at a higher risk for developing fatty liver, and is one of the most common complications associated with going on TPN. And this is mainly because we're infusing fats or lipids directly into the bloodstream, and then they're sent down to be filtered out by the liver. However, TPN is a life-saving therapy and a life-extending therapy. So the benefits far outweigh the risks for most patients. After about 6 months, I was able to get off of the TPN. However, I was not able to get off of the tube feeds. And around the same time, I also started having issues where my stomach wasn't emptying, a condition we call gastroparesis. I was also having severe pain attacks that were coming back. And I began to see a hepatologist, mainly because, as he would point out to me later, my liver enzymes were goofy going all the way back into 2006. Sometimes they would be normal, sometimes they would be mildly elevated, but he said they weren't ever very consistent. So we did a FibroSure test, which is one of the non-invasive markers they do to check on your liver. And we did the FibroSure test showed that I had no fibrosis, but I did have a significant amount of fat in my liver. It also turned out around this time that I had to go in to have another surgery done to help with my gastroparesis problems. And while we were in there, my hepatologist had requested that they obtained an intraoperative liver biopsy since I was already undergoing a surgical procedure. And I know Tony had mentioned this when he was chatting with us, but the liver biopsy is you're really looking for a needle in a haystack. And for me, probably the most interesting result from the liver biopsy was that the biopsy did not show any signs of having islet cells in my liver. But we knew that they had to be there because if not, I would have been requiring insulin around the clock. And it did show that I had fibrosis, but that I had just a mild level of fat. So as my hepatologist said, it was kind of, not super consistent with the clinical picture. So we just decided to start some vitamin E and monitor my liver more closely. A couple months after that, I continued to have issues with my feeding tube and it wouldn't stay in the correct spot. So I had to have another surgery done where they were able to basically go from one feeding tube to two. So I have one that's in my stomach and one that's in my intestines. And this was necessary to get me the nutrition I needed that I wasn't able to do beforehand. Again, since we were already in there, they did obtain another intraoperative biopsy. And this time it showed that there was minimal fibrosis, but there was significant levels of fat, which again did not kind of mesh with the clinical picture as to what was going on. So, and again as well, it also still did not show islet cells. So, we had two biopsies taken and they both, did not show the islet cells that we knew were there. And then they even had disagreed on the level of fibrosis or fat that was in my liver. I like to talk about kind of the impact on function that this fatty liver has on my condition right now. As I mentioned earlier, my liver is doing double duty. It's being a pancreas and it's being a liver. So there are, as Tony mentioned, some patients progress, they develop liver cancer and need a liver transplant. That really would not be an option for me, as I would then lose all insulin producing ability as well. So in patients with my condition, it's even more important that we're able to monitor and hopefully stop the progression of fatty liver so that we don't get to that point. The other interesting part of my story, and the reason I share all the way back to 2006, is, I saw well over 50 different appointments with like 13, 14 different physicians over the 10 years. And although looking back, we noticed that my liver enzymes had trended as being elevated all the way back to that time, nobody ever mentioned fatty liver to me or NASH until after my initial biopsy. And my liver doctor has mentioned to me multiple times that chances are this may have actually been what was underlining my other conditions. It could all have been related to the liver, and we just weren't able to see that. So a couple summary take-home points I'd like to hit. As I think I've demonstrated by sharing my story, the liver biopsies themselves are very prone to issues. When you take such a small sample of the liver, the results can be misleading, especially in the early stages of NAFLD and NASH. And there's also a high risk associated with liver biopsies. Luckily, both of mine were done intraoperatively, where they were able to view the entire liver when they took the biopsy. And to be honest, that's the only way I would be able to have the biopsies taken due to my complex anatomy from my initial surgeries. So keeping that in mind, it is a lot to ask patients to undergo these liver biopsies just to join a clinical trial when there would be no other kind of medical reason for them to undergo them. The other thing that I really wanted to take some time to mention here is that when you think about treatments for fatty liver, I think that there is a real benefit to the patients to stopping the progression of NASH, even if it doesn't necessarily reverse the condition. I'm active in a nonprofit that helps those on TPN and tube feeds. And we do hear lots of stories of TPN patients who get diagnosed with fatty liver. For these patients, TPN is life-saving and life-preserving. And they would greatly benefit from a safe and effective treatment, even if it was only to stop the furthering progression of fatty liver and not address the underlying condition. Also, there's been recent studies showing that 5 to 10 years after the pancreatectomy procedure I had done, that the patients are developing NASH. And like I said, mentioning the folks who are on TPN, for us undergoing these pancreatectomies, therapy that would prevent progression would also be very beneficial. Again, it has been mentioned that having NASH can lead to liver cancer and requiring transplants. So that's also another example of the benefit to stopping progression. As I'm sure folks would agree, liver transplant is not necessarily a cure and carries with it significant risks as well. So I think that my final kind of take-home point here is that there are many life-saving treatments that we receive as patients that put you at a higher risk for developing fatty liver or NASH later in life. And I believe we owe it to these patients to have a treatment available to mitigate that to the extent possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Terry?
Wanted to say hello, as my name is Terry Milton, and I am in Houston, Texas. So way down in the South. Donna, thank you so much for having me today. As Dr. Turner, thank you for the opportunity to speak before all of you. My liver journey started actually in 1998, as I had given blood to the American Red Cross and received a postcard in the mail afterwards. And it basically all it said was, oh, by the way, as your liver enzymes are elevated, you probably need to go ahead and go see your doctor. And so I did, and he sent me on to a GI specialist who specialized in the liver. And after many, many tests, as he said, Terry, he says, you have fatty liver. He says, it's not a big deal. He says, everybody has it. So this is 1998. And I left that appointment, and until 2017, I didn't worry about my liver. I knew I had one, but it wasn't something that was on my mind. Around 2015, I started having lots of different problems. So I was always tired. I was exhausted. Abdominal pain, is pain throughout my body. And it was just one of those mystery things of wondering what in the world was going on. Honestly, is just kind of like with Megan. Megan's mom I was diagnosed with lupus. I was diagnosed with pancreatitis. I was diagnosed with a lot of different things, but really not with what was going on. In August of 2017, we finally decided that possibly my gallbladder was giving me a lot of problems, and decided to do elective gallbladder surgery. And during that surgery, my surgeon found that my liver was cirrhotic, and so went ahead and did a biopsy in 3 places. And I'm so glad that he did at that point. He was already in there and did the biopsy. And I told him as when I came to is no matter what, call me. And so he did. And he says, Terry, he says, you have cirrhosis of the liver. And you also have something called NASH, and that's what causes cirrhosis. And when he said that, is first of all, is to me, kind of like what Tony had said, is cirrhosis. Yeah, I'm not a drinker, how do you get cirrhosis? How did that happen? And then NASH I had no idea what it was. My surgeon wasn't aware of what that meant or even understood what it was. 8 days after my surgery, I gained 40 pounds in in fluid, and ended up back in the hospital because one of my incisions opened up, and I was draining out 2 to 3 liters of fluid each day for 12 days. I was very sick. I was jaundiced. I had gone fully from silent cirrhosis, compensated completely, to decompensated. In October 2017, I had my first hepatic encephalopathy episode. And it was I felt like I was going in slow motion. My world was turned upside down. And I can honestly tell you is I knew what was wrong. It finally, we could connect all the dots and understood is that I was a patient with NASH, but there still wasn't a lot of understanding of what it meant. So I did what everybody else did, is I go to the Dr. Google, and he gave me really bad information and told me I was going to die in the next couple of weeks. But honestly, that made me want to make sure that people had the right information, that they had information that they could use, that could honestly be used to help them. And so I started a search, and I joined a support group. And in 2018, I was hit with another diagnosis. I was hit with a diagnosis of HCC, with hepatocellular carcinoma. Since then, I've had 3 tumors that have been found, 4 different treatments. So I've had a microwave ablation, I've had a radiofrequency ablation, I've had a TACE, transarterial chemoimmobilization, and a TARE, transarterial radio immobilization. And in September of this year 2 additional lesions were found. So we're waiting until December, because at this point in time, my liver's kind of fragile. I am on the transplant list. And every day as I live with pain, I keep anti-nausea medication with me constantly, because I never know when it's going to hit me. There are so many different things that are a part of what I'm doing. So when I look at my life now and before, I realized that, as I took it for granted, is what health looks like. At the time, whenever I was diagnosed with fatty liver, I was not diabetic. I did not have high blood pressure. I did not have, but I am a Hispanic female. And there are a lot more within the Hispanic community that are diagnosed with fatty liver and NASH. And so as I had that going for me, but I know this is that I have made it kind of a passion, a goal, to make sure that not any other patient gets as far as I am. So it's getting the information out there and making sure that patients are aware, that doctors are aware. I've worked with my primary care physician and helping him to build screening into his diagnostic system, especially when patients come in or are diagnosed with diabetes. I get to speak to a lot of different people across the United States, and because of the support groups that I run, is that I get to talk with people from around the world. And just like you've met right now, as I'm the 4th NASH patient you've met this morning, is each one of us have a different story. Each one of us have come from a different place, from a different source, but we're all diagnosed with the same thing. before I retired, I drove special needs buses, and I is worked with a lot of children with autism. And there's a thing that said is that if you've seen one child with autism, you've seen one child with autism. And that goes the same for a NASH patient. If you've seen one NASH patient, you've seen one NASH patient. It is not representative of everybody else because all of our stories are different. I take 18 pills a day and have 5 injections. Those pills treat my symptoms. They don't treat my disease, the underlying disease. And honestly, for me right now, my liver is to an extent that there's not any way to even consider that it would treat anything that comes up. But when I receive a transplant, I want to make sure that that new liver, my new second chance, has an opportunity to thrive, especially if there's a genetic predisposition that because of my Hispanic background, that I have a chance, that my kids do. My daughter is 33. She has been diagnosed with fatty liver. And of course, as a mom, as I'm going to talk to her about it. And as a daughter, she doesn't always listen. But I know that we want for our kids and for our parents and for our brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and friends, we want them to have an opportunity to live, to not live in pain, to not live with the understanding of not knowing. I've put my household in order. I have my will written. I have all the things in place in case I'm not able to make decisions. And I know this is that each and every day is a blessing to me. I have challenging days. I have days that I cannot wake up. I do have overt hepatic encephalopathy. I have had to have varices banded. I have ascites. They have to watch my lungs to make sure that fluid doesn't build up in my lungs and gets pushed up into there. My weight fluctuates because of some of the injections I have to take. But I know this is that even within the midst of that is I have hope that when I speak before groups like this is that you're hearing me. And not only that you're hearing me, but that you have the power to be able to do something, to make those decisions to impact the people that are yet to come. I help build awareness and am excited to be able to do that. But I know this is that if a drug came available, I would be overjoyed. I deal with symptoms every day and side effects of medications. Any kind of side effect would be worth if I didn't have to go through what I am doing now. Like I said, as I am on the transplant list, some of the things have changed a little bit as far as in HCC and exception points since Tony had his transplant. And so now I wait with a lot of other HCC patients, many of them with NASH. We have an epidemic that's going on and it needs to stop. It's a silent killer. How many people have this and don't even know it? And yet when they do find out, there's not much that they can do to even treat it. other than to treat the symptoms. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to address the needs here. I am just overjoyed at this opportunity, and I truly, truly thank you.
Welcome back, everyone, to the second part of the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting in NASH, or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Thank you for everybody who enjoyed such a robust discussion in the first part of the day. Thank you, everyone, for coming back to hear our equally exciting and impactful patient panel. I did want to just give a brief recap before we start, starting with the definition of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, because it's so exciting that so many people outside of our normal circle are joining us today, and this may be their first exposure to the condition, or frankly, any liver disease. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, known as NAFL or NAFLD, is a serious, chronic, and progressive liver condition. NASH is the more advanced form of that condition. It's characterized by an infiltration of fat in the liver, typically over 5%, and increasing as you advance to NASH, such that this extra fat leads to inflammation and injury of the liver cells. And that includes fibrosis and cirrhosis, and can unfortunately progress in some cases to liver cancer. And NASH is soon to become, if it's not already in many areas, the #1 reason for transplantation. So that is what we are talking about today. And we have with us listening our friends at the US Food and Drug Administration, particularly those from the Division of Hepatology and Nutrition, who are responsible for reviewing medications that would bear an indication specifically for the treatment of NASH. And so as we have featured a diversity of patients who are living with NASH, or family members of patients, in some cases, who do not survive their NASH. We have wanted to elevate and give exposure to the impact of NASH on the daily lives of patients, as well as the risks and benefits as patients view them and as patients weigh them, of various aspects of NASH drug development and potential therapies. And so this patient-focused drug development meeting is part of an entire package of information that we as a community will be presenting to the Food and Drug Administration, which includes a survey that has been widely circulated to get an increasing number of patients beyond those who we are so privileged to have with us today, to make sure that we have as wide a diversity and representation of patient and caregiver experiences with NASH as part of our final report. And so that said, I am very happy to introduce our next panel, which will focus on issues around diagnosis and clinical trial design, barriers to participation, as we try to create patient-centered clinical trials and really ensure that patients are fully integrated in liver health research. So I invite to the virtual stage with me Bruce Dimming, Suzanne Mazer, and the inimitable Wayne Eskridge. So please join me. Also, for those of you who are joining us who are new to the liver community and liver patient presentations, many of us wear burgundy as a signal of liver health. There are many colors, of course, for many different conditions, but we like to focus on the optimism and the aspiration that everyone who has a liver can have a healthy liver. And so that is why you see us wearing this color. So that said, Bruce, I see you are teed up and ready to go. Why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Donna. Well, first of all, thank you to GLI, Donna, everybody that's helped me get to this point, and to the FDA for spending time with us. Again, my name is Bruce Dimming. I'm from the Metro Phoenix area out in Arizona, and I've been living with my liver disease for over 10 years now. And to be honest, my doctors still don't know exactly what I have or why I have it, which they call cryptogenic or idiopathic. My journey started back in early 2012 when I was having micronaps driving into work, and diagnosed with sleep apnea at that point, but that didn't explain everything. And then about a month or so later, this huge bruise showed up on my one shin, and it was like, well, where the heck did this come from? So that started the old kids game, the hip bone connected to the thigh bone, connected to the, whatever, which basically led me down. Okay, well, why do you have the bruise? Well, you have thrombocytopenia. Well, why do you have thrombocytopenia? Well, you have an enlarged spleen. Well, why do you have an enlarged spleen? Well, you have portal hypertension. Well, why do you have portal hypertension? Well, that led to, over that 1 year, I had an endoscopy, 5 MRIs, 3 CT scans, bone marrow biopsy, which is very, very painful when you have a needle inserted into your pelvis, X-ray, ultrasounds, and 27 blood tests. And in addition to the bone marrow biopsy, I had 2 other liver biopsies, one during a transjugular venogram and one laparoscopic. I'll focus on the biopsies for a minute right now, because we've been kind of talking about those for most of the day. And while the liver community or the doctors consider the biopsy to be the quote unquote gold standard for diagnosing liver disease or NASH, they are not infallible. And as John and others noted earlier, they're invasive and they can cause complications. In my personal case, the transjugular one was what they called fragmented enough that they couldn't really come up with any definitive diagnosis. So that's when they decided that they were going to do a second one, the laparoscopic. And during that procedure, that caused some bleeding and enough pain that I was given morphine, which then stopped my bowels. Not to get gross about it, but and then I was in the hospital for 4 days until I could go to the bathroom again. So again, the biopsies, while are sometimes needed, they're not the end all, the cure all to end all. And subsequent, a few years later, back in 2019, I had a liver wedge biopsy that was performed while they were taking my gallbladder out, and it didn't show the level of damage that my symptoms were still and still are indicating. Therefore, my doctors had agreed that it could be what they call a quote unquote sampling error, meaning they took a sample in an area that had yet to be affected by my liver disease, reinforcing the point that biopsies are not always accurate or complete picture of the whole liver. My experiences that I've just enumerated led me to be an advocate for non-invasive diagnostic, my encephalopathy is bad today, and tools and medications. I really think there needs to be more research and study done on liver disease and NASH. And again, as was noted earlier, there's still this stigma of one being an alcoholic, drug user, or suffering from Hep C as to why you have liver disease. As some of you may know, fatty liver is now becoming or is due to such issues such as obesity and metabolic syndrome, and is fast becoming the leading factor behind the development of all types of, well, not all types, but most liver disease. Personally, I was diagnosed with metabolic syndrome many years ago, before starting my liver journey, which started with the bruise, as I discussed earlier, but was never told that this could lead to liver disease or NASH. And I went through many years of dealing with that, with cholesterol and triglycerides and all that kind of fun stuff. So I believe that there needs to be more medication and treatment developed for this early stage, again, as we were discussing earlier, so that we can prevent the progression to the more severe and chronic conditions. Because if I had the knowledge that I had now, back when I was first diagnosed with metabolic syndrome, or that my cholesterol levels and triglyceride levels had gone up, I might not be in the position that I am today. Then also, about a year into my journey, I was diagnosed with hepatic encephalopathy. As we discussed earlier, this is when toxins in your blood aren't filtered out by your liver and they go to your brain, causing a variety of issues such as mental fog, confusion, etc. Now, for me, unlike some others earlier today, my hepatic sorry, again, my encephalopathy is bad today. My encephalopathy is constant. It never goes away. I always have it. I always have the fatigue. I always have the mental fog. And again, as was discussed, I take Xifaxan, lactulose to help manage the symptoms, but it doesn't deal with the actual cause. And because of this encephalopathy, because of I have many blackouts due to it, I am not allowed to drive. My hepatologist back in September 2013 said, did you drive here? Yeah. Well, you're driving home, parking the car, and you're never driving again. Because it's actually worse for me if I went driving and had an accident or something like that, because I know I have this diagnosis and I'd be in deep doo-doo if I, with the law and insurance. So, as I said earlier too, with other things, more research and study needs to be done for this symptom, because again, the patient kind of gets lumped into this like bell curve, that everything has to be between, a D and a B, where with maybe a little bit an A and F kind of thing, because my symptoms weren't normal as the profession understood them. So I was and still being evaluated at an Alzheimer's clinic because, well, gee, these aren't normal, so it's probably not encephalopathy. Well, the neurologist has ruled that out. It's not neurological. It's not Alzheimer's. It's encephalopathy. So again, we all experience liver disease differently. And as was discussed earlier too, the side effects of some of the medications that you take for encephalopathy aren't exactly fun. Another point would be that since the start of my journey, since 2012, I've been diagnosed with everything from fatty liver to NAFLD, to cirrhosis, to focal nodular regenerative hyperplasia, to the possibility of NASH. And this kind of leads us back to the need for more and more accurate and more non-invasive tests, because my hepatologist will not give me a formal quote unquote NASH diagnosis, even though I have the enlarged liver. I have the steatosis in the liver, very high fat content. But in his opinion, the only way he can give me a formal NASH diagnosis is with a biopsy. And at this point in my journey, they are against doing a biopsy because it really wouldn't change right now, at least in their mind, it wouldn't change how they treat me with doing imaging every 6 months, blood work every 6 months. So basically, I'm just kind of sitting around waiting for my my liver to fail before they're going to do anything else. I feel like the Thelma and Louise in the movie. You know, my liver's in the car driving towards the cliff, and I just don't know if and when I'm going to go over the edge. The other issue that Donna had mentioned that we're kind of trying to focus on is the clinical trials. I was only part of one clinical trial, and that was basically just an observational where they took my blood once a year and would, I guess, pull my chart to see what was going on. But because most of the time, because of not having a specific diagnosis or diagnosis long enough, or having symptoms that aren't quote unquote normal for liver disease, I don't qualify for a lot of clinical trials because sometimes the parameters, and again, I understand the need for having parameters so the clinicians can figure out kind of what's going on with their medication, their procedure, their drug, and everything. But there needs to be something done to be more inclusive of the not normal symptoms that people have. I just think they're a little too restrictive at times. I mean, I'd love to be able to take part in ones, like I was saying earlier too. To me, the risk would be worth it. I want to know what I have and why I have it. I mean, going 10 years without knowing what the heck you have or why you have it. I mean, you know, what do you do? So I guess to conclude, you know, diet is important. Medications are important, and as both of you know, both of these things are under the purview of the FDA. You know, I implore you to look at the issues of diet. You know, more education being done for the broader population as to how diet affects the liver, or you know, the things that they need to be aware of, and more medications to be developed to understand and treat not only the symptoms but the cause. You know, therefore, I'm just asking for the FDA and through the efforts of GLI to protect our health by developing these new drugs, provide better food, and the disease education for this, you know, expanding the scope and scale of clinical trials. I mean, I could probably go on forever and ever, but I want to thank again Donna and everybody at GLI and FDA for listening to us today. And I'll leave it to the next person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you. Suzanne?
My name, as you know, is Suzanne Maisner from Tucson, Arizona. I'm a person with NASH, as far as I know. Diagnosis is tricky, and so is follow-up from a clinical trial. After 2 years of common blood count tests showing skyrocketing liver enzyme levels, my doctor conceded to send me to a specialist. Not a hepatologist, but a GI guy. Several weeks after taking a blood test, his office called to say that I have stage 3 liver disease and that there was nothing more to be done other than to get to work on my bucket list. I can tell you, I felt like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming diesel truck. It was incredibly dreadful to get this when there had been no indication of this prior to that. I have a master's degree in gerontology, the study of aging. I know how to research medical journals and studies. I plowed through journal articles trying to understand my stage 3 diagnosis. Part of the research took me to the American Liver Foundation. They advised me that the test that I took was, and it was a chemical blood test, was known not to be very accurate, and that an imaging test would provide more accurate information. They directed me to some clinical trials where I could get a FibroScan imaging test and participate in a cure. The FibroScan placed me in the middle range of NASH progression. I enrolled in a double-blind study. Other than saying the initial FibroScan, I received no other information on my liver disease. I was unaware of any changes reflected in subsequent FibroScans and blood tests for the duration of the study. The lack of transparency is a problem. Study participants should know how the experimental drug affected them. I would have liked to have known if it stopped the disease or reversed it. Every day that I was on the trial medication, I felt sick and weak. It may have been the medication or the progression of the disease. Because I had no way of knowing if it was the medication or NASH, I stuck it out until the 4th and final month. I probably would have completed it if I saw the results of the monthly scans and tests during that period. However, as a double-blind study, neither I nor the doctors had access to the results. I ended up going off the drug the 4th and final month because of the reaction I was having. Since a clinical trial was denying me access to information on the tests, my only recourse was to go to my primary care doctor to get routine blood tests. The test showed that my enzyme levels were back in the normal range. Because they had no record of an official NASH diagnosis and my liver enzymes were back in the normal range again, I was told by my doctor that they could not justify referring me to a liver specialist for a FibroScan or follow-up. To date, I do not know the impact of the experimental medication on my NASH, nor the long-term effects of its efficacy. For all I know, the lower readings were a temporary blip. 2 years later, I don't know if my NASH was cured, stopped, or the progression of the disease was temporarily stopped. I've looked for further clinical trials so that I can get a FibroScan and analysis to determine where my NASH level is now. All the trials that I have identified locally require a liver biopsy as a precondition for enrolling. There is no way that I would take on the risk of a liver biopsy due to the danger of the procedure unless I was in a critical situation. Requiring a liver biopsy to participate in NASH trials is just overkill. I believe it will limit subject participation unless the prospective subjects are ill-informed. Imaging tests, including MRE, MRI, and FibroScans, can be used for diagnostics in various phases of the trials. Again, there is no need for a liver biopsy to diagnose NASH or make it a precondition for the trials. As a NASH patient, I would like to see clinical trials using imaging other than that. I'd like to have transparency, if not during the trial, then afterwards. The results of the trial medication on our NASH disease should be disclosed to us. The lack of test data is a deterrent to engaging in such studies. I participated because I understand the importance of research. Despite my desire to help find a cure, I will not participate in trials as long as a liver biopsy is a precondition for enrollment in a study. My story is not unique. There are some common themes. One is the lack of clarity and transparency for patients in clinical trials. The result has been that I still do not know how the trial impacted me, nor what stage of NASH I am in, or if it permanently cured the disease. And I can say that I know from the initial blood work that it did make somewhat of a difference then, but as we speak now for the past month, I've had the horrific fatigue coming back again. So my suspicion is that the trial medication I had may have been effective for a short while, and I probably need more so that the disease doesn't progress and I don't have this really horrible fatigue. The real deterrent for this is when patients with NASH are put into a dangerous situation where they must choose between a dangerous diagnostic liver biopsy or not participating in a clinical trial. All of these issues deserve urgent attention. As for me, I'm on the fence about participating again, given the limitations. Thank you for your time today, and I welcome questions. And I have one more thing that I want to say. I heard Bruce speak before, and I want to personally thank Bruce for sharing more about your journey. I learn each time I hear you speak, and you are heroic, and you are one of the people I believe who will make a difference in finding a cure for NASH. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. And I wholeheartedly agree with your assessment and your gratitude to Bruce. Having had a hepatic encephalopathy, I recognize how difficult it is for him to make this contribution today. Mr. Eskridge.
There we go. Thank you, Donna, and thanks to FDA for participating in this. It's an opportunity we don't often get. So I'm Wayne Eskridge. I'm the founder, CEO, and a cirrhosis patient of the Fatty Liver Foundation. And as I thought about this presentation, I could tell you my story personally, but it's very like the ones you've heard. And I share bits and pieces of my my journey with most of the people that have been on here. So I'd like to actually talk a bit about the relationship of the patient community and the FDA. I really didn't think much about FDA at all until I found out that I was a cirrhosis patient and started to think about clinical trials and all of the things that go along with that. And as I think about what the FDA is, you know, we want you to be our champions. We want you to be our protectors. We understand the need for the service that you do, which is to really care about us and to keep us well, give us an opportunity to have effective medications. And that's really a vital relationship that's meaningful to us. And there's something about your role, which is the inertia that it needs to have. There's this real risk if you were to be stampeded into things, and we don't want that to happen. We want you to be thoughtful and to think about things and to use due care. But you know, one of the things that happens in your world is that you're surrounded by this giant tornado of lawyers and people that want to catch you and charge you with things and beat up on you. And you've got your army of lawyers that's defending you, and you're behind your shield wall. So there's a gulf that builds up between regulators like you and people like us who you serve. And over the years, I think that's gotten wider. And this effort to close that gap, I think, is really important, and it's extremely valuable to us as patients. But as we think about that, that level of inertia, what the consequence of that is something to think about, I think. Because if we look behind us and we look at 10,000 deaths and we say, oh, that is terrible, and we tisk, and that's a statistic. If we think about the future and 10,000 people who are dying now, that's not as convenient because we may come and complain. So, that's the balance that you walk, because what you do can have a tremendous impact on our death, really. And as we think about biopsy, I get offended by the reference to biopsy as the gold standard. Now, it's more like a tin standard. We started doing biopsies in the 1920s. We've been doing needle biopsies for 100 years. And that was the best we had. It really was. And we learned a lot. But it is very difficult as a gold standard, because you get two pathologists and they won't necessarily see them the same way. You won't necessarily get the same reading of the same slide from the same pathologist. So the big variation that we see in reading of biopsies is such a hazard to this whole development process. And so we need to be more sensitive to saying this is such a gold standard, because it hazards the development, and it historically was the best we had, but it's quickly becoming not the best that we have. An important thing to think about, and I think that it's something that FDA should really think closely about, is that we're living in a time that is unlike anything we've ever seen. Information, medical information. In the 50s, it was doubling every 50 years. By 2010, they estimate it was doubling every 3.5 years. There's estimates that say by 2020, medical knowledge was doubling every 0.2 of a year. That's 73 days. The simple fact is that any of you who got out of med school or out of your education in 2010, the information that was available at that time is about 10% of the medical knowledge that we have today. And yet we persist with the biopsy with its historical muscle as what we focus on. So I think that it would be really important for FDA to realize and to be proactive about the fact that the rate of change of knowledge is so fast that you need to be, you've got all these timetables, 6 months, and with FDA is not a long time. You have lengthy processes that you go through, and there's not a sense of urgency about a lot of things that matches what we see going on in the world. And this disease is advancing through our society at such a horrendous rate, that we really need to get a handle on it as quickly as we can. And I want you to use due care, and I don't want you to put me in a position to hurt me, but you have us yoked to biopsy, and the things that are coming forward today, really deserve to have a lot more lot faster integration into the process. You know, you have your Subpart H process, but you really have pretty much limited us to biopsy there. And, you know, we see things like the corrected T1s and the 3D MREs, and we see the pathology. Well, even if we want to stick with biopsy, we at least should digitize all those slides, because at least the computer can duplicate what it says every time. And we don't have to have that huge variation. So we need to proactively work to adopt the advances that are happening in such a fast pace, because science and knowledge and, you know, the whole ability to understand is advancing so quickly. You know, we're looking at the behavior of chemical reactions in living cells. I mean, you couldn't have even thought of that 25 years ago. So, you know, we need to take advantage of that. And it's important, I think, for the FDA to remember that you went through a critical path initiative at one time, and you looked into the processes that were most important. And I think that it's time to, you know, to recognize the value of this torrent of advancement that we're going through, and that if you can try to build a more responsive system and to not be satisfied with, well, yeah, a meeting in 6 months will be a good thing. I mean, a meeting, it doesn't take 6 months to put a lot of these things together. And I would really like to see, you know, that kind of thoughtful advancement of the timetable of things that you go through. And it's not, I don't want you to needlessly rush, but I don't want you to just sit back behind your shield wall and do things like you always have, because we've been doing it that way for 50 years. So I greatly appreciate the opportunity to have this comment, and thank you for the time.
Wayne, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Wayne. And thank you to Suzanne and Bruce as well. You can all join me on screen for the Q&A. Wayne, I wanted to start by addressing your points so eloquently made, so thoughtfully made. And I agree that we have an obligation as patients and as leaders of patient advocacy organizations to take very seriously the power and the impact of patient voice when we are making requests of regulators. And that is the reason that we are having this patient-focused drug development meeting today and conducting the survey, so that we can be as representative and diverse and as grounded as possible in the types of structured and unstructured information that we're providing, and along with the most current literature that we believe underscores the points that we are making, so that we can be as pervasive as possible, as persuasive as possible with our points, but not merely from a position of passion or emotion, but grounded in the evidence, including patient-generated evidence, which doesn't always get the respect that it deserves. So I thank you for making that point about what our role and responsibility is as patients to define what we value in in a regulatory process in in medications and treatments for us, and as the panel before us started to explore the how we weight various trade-offs in the various therapies. So I think that those points are hopefully very well taken. I would also point to your point about biopsy as a hazard to the development process. I think that not only needs to be heard by FDA, which it is today, but by pathologists, by medical societies and those who are creating guidelines, and as well as the regulators, because often it is the fact that biopsy has been or NASH has been a disease literally defined as biopsy diagnosed that sometimes makes it hard for regulators to do otherwise. But I agree that everyone across these stakeholder groups should be recognizing the rapid evolution and improvement of technology around non-invasive diagnosis. And as we heard in the previous panel, the clinical practice and diagnosis and management of patients is fast outpacing what is being required in a regulatory environment. And so there is that mismatch that we would like to bring into alignment. So I certainly could not agree more. If I could take our time with all three of you to walk through various parts of NASH clinical trials so that we can give some more granularity to what we are seeking in describing an improved, if not an optimal, clinical trial in this space for patients. And Suzanne, I'll start with you because you were so wonderful in terms of expressing things that many patients have have found wanting in their clinical trial participation. And I'll start with and then we'll sort of go from a little more systematically through the research process. But I would like to start with the point that you were making about the duplication and testing that you needed to go through and the lack of information that you had, even though you had contributed so much information during the course of the trial. So let me just ask for your thoughts and recommendations on how, without, voiding the sort of double-blind, placebo-controlled, sort of the standard clinical trial construct to be able to get valid results, how could they have served you better, served and honored your participation in the trial better, and helped you avoid that duplication of tests, which, it seems to have done, quite a bit of harm in causing delays and deterring access to needed care services. What would you recommend they do differently?
There we go. I'm hearing two different things in your question. One of them is, during the trial, what could have been done differently given that it was a double blind study. The other thing I heard is prior to entering that study, what could have been done differently in terms of the testing for the diagnosis. Is that correct? Right. Okay.
I think I'd be happy to have you answer both. Yes.
Okay. For the first one, the first part of the journey, and this speaks to something that Bruce brought up, is that, there are hints of NASH before that doctors have, right? That, you're having elevated levels, liver enzyme levels, you're presenting some of the symptoms. So if they know and they that you're headed towards fatty liver disease or pre-diabetes, doctors, I think, need to be educated so that they can educate others and let them know that if it's unabated, that they will end up with liver disease. Patients need to know that it's the beginning of a progressive, serious disease, and they need to stop it then. I can tell you I would have made more changes, not that I wasn't exercising or eating well or doing the things within, that you're supposed to be doing, but I would have been a lot more vigorous about it. So I think that doctors need to know, and that as soon as they have that information, they need to send someone or send out to get a diagnostic test, being an MRI, MRE, FibroScan. FibroScan is probably the cheapest, and for that, so that they know that and can get people started on a course of treatment via clinical trials. Now, for the clinical trial, I understand with the double-blind study that the people, and that these are often quite large clinical trials in multiple cities and states, but I think that at the end of the trial, that information should be sent back to the individuals on a diagnostic imaging test, a summary, and the test results. I know that during the course of it, they can't let you know, but certainly they can let you know at the end of the study what the outcome was, because they have the information there and it's only one person's outcome. That would have made it a lot better. Had I had that information, I would have known more how to handle my disease. And another frustration is that even if it had stopped it or reduced the impact of it, the question is always, for how long? Is this a temporary blip or not? So I think that there should be follow-up studies there. And if there aren't, I could have at least gone somewhere within the medical community to say, okay, that's what it is. Let me have another FibroScan, let me have another MRI or whatever, so that I could manage it better. And right now, the patients are the ones that are managing this disease. It isn't the doctors.
Well, that's always the case. I like to sort of make the comment about shared decision making. I was like, yes, the difference is I'm going to share my decision with the physician. They somehow think it's the other way around. I think that's very important. There have been patients who have had diagnoses of cancer during a trial that was not revealed to them, or certainly just the recognition of the burden that getting the testing, whether it's imaging or blood work or visits, and information that you are contributing to the trial. And I can continue to use that term, that you are making these contributions to the trial. And so to not have access to that information, for your own health is harmful. And I think those who are doing trials well recognize and do try to return that information as soon as possible, so the information can serve the patients who contributed in the first place. Let's take a step back and just go through. We have time to go through a lot of the various aspects of clinical trials. So we've certainly talked about the limitations of biopsies and using biopsy, the need for requirement for biopsy to enter trials. Based on your own experience, and Wayne, certainly you have talked to dozens, hundreds of patients and have conducted your own screening study. Do you believe that we would be further along in enrollment in NASH clinical trials, and thus in our NASH development, if biopsy were no longer a requirement for those trials?
Well, it poses a different problem for medicine when we do that, and this is the dilemma that we're on the brink of, because the liver disease is such a continuum of diseases and variations of diseases, and there's no silver bullet, there's no single solution to this. So as the drug developers are trying to sort this out, they do need to be able to get a population in their study that has characteristics that meet the criteria of the target that they're particularly looking at. So, you know, we have had great difficulty having the specificity in our testing to achieve that in the past, but we are on the brink of being able to do that in a much better way through the new imaging technologies that are developing and the wet methods that are developing. So I can't criticize too much for the past several, decades, but my point is we're right there where we can begin to become more laser shot at the populations that need to be developed, and those can be identified without necessarily having to have a biopsy. And I agree that there's places where a biopsy needs to be done. I don't say do away with biopsy, but we need to augment that whole process with these other tools and not just make biopsy the be all end all.
Do you believe that there is clarity around when we will have reached that threshold for when biopsy is no longer necessary, and the lines, clarity around the lines of those situations where it is useful and when it, no longer, has outlasted its value?
Well, we're getting very close. They just approved Medicare for the CT1 test, which is really quite a lovely non-invasive MRI-based test. But we're looking at the individual molecules on the surface of cells. So to say that we are far away from being able to say we want people that have this kind of cell response, and to be able to use lab techniques to find that in wet methods. The science is rapidly coming on with that, and we need to encourage that to be integrated into how we make decisions on, what population best suits the trial. We have this shotgun situation now because we have this wide variation of detail in how a person is diseased, and that's part of why we have such a big placebo problem, is that we're not specific enough to the mechanism of the drug, and so we're not getting to the ideal patients for those kinds of tests. But we're on the brink of that in this tremendous explosion of information that we're experiencing, and the acceleration of knowledge is just it's overwhelming to people like me that dig information. You know,
I love your optimism. I'm going to ask Bruce a question to get him into this conversation. We've had questions, from the audience about personalization of diagnosis and of treatment in NASH. We certainly see that in cancer. I appreciate being married to a geneticist and having served on the board of the Personalized Medicine Coalition. So I love this question. You're a perfect example that there seem to be many types and subtypes of NASH, perhaps, different combinations of concurrent diseases. I refuse to call them comorbidities because I do not like to be reminded of the different ways I might die. So concurrent diseases that can accompany NASH. And so when you think about the different diagnostic techniques, whether they're biopsy or non-invasive, to be able to come up with a tailored diagnosis and management plan for you, what would you like to see? Yep.
My HE, I spaced out there for a minute.
We all do it.
I think the biggest thing, since you mentioned the cancer thing, is, you see the commercials on TV for the Cancer Treatment Centers of America, where it's a team approach kind of thing. I would really love to see that in the broader disease population, if you will, because everybody has their own little silo, and they only treat that little silo. And as you're saying, not to call it a comorbidity, but to call it a co-disease. I have heart issues, I have metabolic issues, I have sleep apnea, I have kidney issues, and I've had my nephrologist and the hepatologist pointing fingers at each other, going, no, it's because of the liver, no, it's because of the kidneys, instead of getting together and going, okay, let's figure this out, and let's do it as a team, not as a separate God, I can't even think of it. I used to be able to talk really well.
That's all right.
Not the individual specialty, but let's look at the whole person. Let's look at their whole disease. I think part of the problem too is, I don't know if this is getting off topic a little bit, but I think it is related in the fact that, when you see your doctor, and again, this is no fault of their own, it's the system, you're there for 15 or 20 minutes, maybe a half an hour, or if you're going to spend a lot of bucks, maybe an hour. So they only have a limited time with you, plus the fact that they see so many patients during the day, they only have maybe 10, 15 minutes, maybe half an hour to look at your chart before they see you. So there's, a whole lack of time and effort to be able to understand the whole issue of, okay, what does this patient need? Why is this? And again, this may be a little bit off topic, but one of the other things I've had to deal with is I'm the one that's having to come up with ideas on, well, gee, could it be this? Could it be that? Instead of the doctor saying, gee, we think that it may be this, it may be that, why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? Perfect example is on the website Inspire, there's one lady that had pointed out that she had persistent and constant HE, and they found her issue to be portosystemic shunts that she had embolization done for, and it cleared it up. So I've asked both my nephrologist and my hepatologist. As a matter of fact, I hit him up at my EGD this past week, and they both said, yeah, that's a definite possibility. So now I have to try to talk them into getting a tri-phase CT done to you know, to hopefully maybe find out whether it is that or not. So I don't know. Like I said, I may have rambled on, but I hopefully I answered your question.
Let me ask this question. Is the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial, even if it is so-called, placebo versus drug, or standard of care versus the study treatment, is that potentially an opportunity for patients to be able to get more time, more attention, more even coordinated care than they may be currently getting in a field that's so new and where education and management options or management best practices are not well dispersed? Maybe I'll have each of you answer that question about the opportunity to receive better care in a clinical trial.
If I can start then, absolutely. I mean, I would jump at the chance. Like we were just saying, the opportunity to get a more in-depth look at what's going on and maybe finding something that you didn't know before. Like you or I think you said that, so they found that somebody had cancer in a study that wasn't known before. I'd jump at the chance to have that. Absolutely.
Wayne?
We talk to thousands of people in our peer-to-peer community, and I consistently give that advice because so many people have great difficulty getting care. They have trouble getting to a specialist, or their insurance plans won't help them much, or they don't have insurance. And the very best opportunity to have care is in a trial. So we always try to emphasize that with people because it is the only situation where you have people really watching, because they don't want you to have any problems, and they want you to get through the trial. So you get a really good care in most trials, and there are exceptions, but generally that's the case.
Suzanne, your thoughts about standard of care, but I also wanted to ask you another question based on your expertise as a gerontologist, perhaps about the value of patient-reported outcomes measures and different questionnaires that assess quality of life and other aspects that can be included in trials.
I'll have to get back to you on that, in terms of this, the design with that, with quality of life and everything.
Okay.
And it always is a mixed thing. Whenever you have an individual in a trial, there's always other factors that may play into it. And in fact, for me, with the diagnosis, I was thinking, well, am I just getting older? Is that why I have this tremendous fatigue? And I was asking all of my friends, and my doctor at the time wasn't that helpful. I did want to go back to the question that Wayne and Bruce answered about the quality of care in that. And I'm a little bit different. I'm more cynical about it.
Okay.
In medicine, as well as other businesses, time is money. So I don't know so much about the quality of care that you're going to get from participating in a study. What you do have is, one, you participate because you're hopefully going to be, contributing to a cure. And secondly, you may get some medicine that helps you, but you won't necessarily know about that. And again, in studies, you may get the information you need at the beginning, which was my experience in getting the FibroScan, which finally showed, yes, this is what it is. This is where it's staged. But unless you have information throughout or at the after the conclusion of the study, you're not going to get it. And if these, unless unless the drug companies, did something by providing extra compensation for time for the doctors, and researchers having time to talk to the patients about what's going on then. But, I'm a little more cynical, and my experience was not the same as that.
I think that's why we have a diversity of opinions on this panel, because as I said in the beginning, there is not the voice of the patient. There are voices of patients, and we want people to hear that variety and diversity of experience. So I thank you for going against the grain. I want you all to do that, and feel free to give me your honest opinions. That helps everyone in this process. I wanted to ask about then the length of trial people might be willing to participate in. If getting your information during a trial may be a hurdle or a challenge, or being on in the non-drug arm and the placebo arm, when a drug that may be effective, is it problematic that a trial may go on for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years before you could get that information or an answer or access to a drug that may be helpful? Even if we understand that, sometimes liver disease takes some time to progress, particularly if cardiovascular or other outcomes are the endpoint. Does that pose a dilemma for patients participating to potentially be stuck or trapped in a trial of multiple years?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a hard journey, which in part depends upon how bad you feel. It's easier if you're not battling the possibility you're going to be dead in 6 months to think about having some extended journeys, and the level of your symptoms. It's just human nature. If it's difficult over a long time and you don't see the benefit, it's hard to stick with it, which is really difficult for the trial people, the people that run the trials, because keeping people enrolled is hard. It's hard for us.
Suzanne, your thoughts on the length of trial? We've also had questions from the audience in, why do things take so long as they are on the different phases? I think Pancreatectomy might be a little spoiled by what just happened in COVID-19 vaccine, approval, but, certain things take time, and particularly if certain diseases progress at different rates or slowly in some cases, that may be the reason why certain phases take certain time. But on the question of, is it problematic to have trials that last for years, thus foreclosing options for patients to do other things for their care?
It's an interesting question, because I think right now, the length of time wouldn't pose a real problem for me personally, and probably for others, because there isn't a cure yet. There aren't medications for NASH unless things have changed. So if there's no medications, what do you have to lose? Right? And I know, having worked as a gerontologist and with people who have Alzheimer's and the medications they're all gung-ho for it. And I think it's for most of us. We have a disease for which there's no cure. We will stick with it as long as we can. I mean, what difference if it's a placebo or not, given that there's no cure yet? And the longer it goes on, I think the better it is, unless people are having an adverse response to the medication. I think that's going to change once there is a cure. People are going to want that. But, you know, so long as there's no cure, you know, there's no better alternative.
So that is a really important consideration, that, you know, currently with no treatment, that time frame does not pose you know, a particular challenge. But if a drug were approved in the interim, then the ethical considerations or equipoise would change slightly. Bruce, you have your hand up. Please, please weigh in.
I would, you know, agree with what Wayne said regarding, you know, depending on how sick you were and, you know, what your individual need was. As I kind of I may have mentioned when I was giving my little testimony there, I was enrolled in I guess it was called a clinical trial. Basically, it was again, you know, they took blood work once a year and they had access to your charts to figure out something. The one thing I'll add, I don't know if it's Wayne maybe can answer this, but at least in the case of the one that I was in, it basically had an escape clause that, you know, if at some point you felt that you couldn't or didn't want to take part anymore, you could basically resign from it. So I think that's kind of an important thing, that, you know, if you know, you feel you're getting sicker and the trial is going to take too long, you know, I think that's kind of an important aspect. And just so you know, the one that I was participating in was a 5-year trial, or a 5-year study, if you will. So again, taking into account, you know, how sick you are and so forth, a lengthy trial would not prohibit me or scare me away from taking part in one.
That's very, very helpful. And I think there are a lot of patients who would appreciate this sort of thoughtful calculation and weighing as they're thinking about weighing the decision whether or not to consent into a trial. Let me ask a question about access to trials. You know, Wayne, you live in lovely Idaho. You know, how far do you travel to get care? I know you've thought through the issues of access to trials for people in rural locations. What you know, what can be done to make sure that trials are more accessible to all the people who need them, regardless of location?
Well, that's so hard. My personal situation is that the nearest hepatologist, who's usually the one doing the studies, is 300 miles. So to see my doctor, I go 300 miles. And we tried to, I guess in hindsight, I'm glad I screen failed, but we actually tried to get into a trial where I would have had to make that trip every week for a year.
Wow.
Yeah, that was.
Would that have been feasible for most of the patients that you do?
No, hardly anybody can do that. I mean, you really have to be retired or not have anything else to do besides drive back and forth. But for us, it's very difficult to get into most trials today, and that's true of a lot of America. There's a lot of disease out there that is just not reachable in the trials. But there's also something that's striking to me, is that we did a study. It's called the Sun Study, where we went out into the community in Houston and we were testing people that were asymptomatic. And they're within 20 miles of the Texas Medical Center, and you know, one of the great medical communities in the world, and they didn't go there. They didn't have they did not see themselves as having access to that resource. And many of them didn't even have physicians, didn't even have primary care docs. So, you know, it's you don't have to be 300 miles away to have dysfunctional access. So there's a lot of challenges in how we reach out to communities and how we bring them into the clinical trial space. So there's a lot of work to do there.
I think that's so important on access is more than just location. It is language and cultural concordance of physicians, and it's about the message as well as the messenger, and feeling welcome into the space. And I love the fact that you brought screening to people rather than expecting people to go to screening. I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of, and I see, you know, a lot of research networks, and we can do a lot more to reach out into communities to help with this, so that at the end of the day, when hopefully we do have a NASH treatment or a slew of NASH treatments available, they do reflect the various types and subtypes that we're seeing of NASH. We can be assured that they work in different populations. And I think that would give us confidence in the treatments that are, that do come to become available. I wanted to continue that point about thinking through the factors or support services that would make somebody more likely to participate in a trial and be successful in, you know, staying with the trial, you know, throughout whatever term it did have. Sure.
Can I speak to the previous point for a second, please?
Absolutely.
You know, in talking about the location issue, even though I live in the Metro Phoenix area, most of if a clinical trial is being held, it would be held at one of the major hospitals, which are located in Central Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
And that, from where I live, is still 35 to 40 miles away. So even though you may be in a quote unquote major city, it doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to get to, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm not allowed to drive.
Right.
So I have to rely on public transportation, public quote unquote, through the paratransit system, you know, for disabled people. I have to rely on that, and that would be such a burden to try to use that to get to and from, you know, trial appointments and so forth. And even if it was farther, like Wayne's saying, you know, 100, 200, 300 miles, I'm not allowed to travel alone either. So even if I had to fly someplace or whatever, I'd have to have somebody accompany me because of my encephalopathy. You know, you mentioned something about Wayne, you know, with screenings being a little bit dispersed. That would be really helpful in trials to have access to the trial on a dispersed basis. Now I realize, you know, you can't have something every place, but you know, either have it, now that we have the stuff, you know, online, you know, being able to do stuff online, maybe have a contract with a local imaging center or blood lab. They could have a contract with to one that you could get to get that kind of work done, instead of having to go to a centralized location. I mean, that would eliminate some of the barriers that I would experience to participating in a trial. So thank you.
I think that that's very important, and something that we have certainly seen advance during the past 2 years with COVID, that decentralized trials, hybrid trials that were a combination of, just as you described, you know, labs done in home or close to someone's home through, laboratory network and telehealth visits, and then maybe, the rare in-person visit to the, a central trial site. But you make a very important point that I want people to understand as they're constructing trials and setting numbers for participation, and that it's not just the time for a particular procedure or an element of the trial. It's the entire time of the patient and a caregiver to take time off of work or just to get themselves together, to travel by some means, some distance to the site, to wait, to do the variety of visits. Maybe there's fasting, there's time in between things, travel back home from, running around the campus of the medical campus perhaps. And then you're exhausted, like you're done, like you may be done for, 2 days or something, having done that, you and your caregiver. It's not, whenever I hear, oh, well, a biopsy is only 20 minutes, I'm like, no, it's a 2-day thing for a lot of people. And that's not accounted for when you look at the burden of clinical trial participation, or think about how many patients can feasibly be enrolled at their level of disease severity. So I believe, from everything I've been hearing across the panel, that thinking about constructing trials in NASH is perhaps a bit more complicated than people have thought about to date.
Can I jump in here?
Yes,
One
please.
that wasn't mentioned during those trials is just the level of fatigue and discomfort after having like 5 vials of blood drawn over a several hour period. And the sugar stuff they give you, which I assume is mandatory in a lot of the testing to see how it impacts your sugar levels as well as your liver enzymes. So you are pretty fatigued. When I went through the trial that I did, I drove maybe 15 minutes away, but after each one of those, I would have to go home, just whomped, and sleep the rest of the afternoon. So the idea of someone driving even an hour is just not feasible for that. And if you want to draw in people from the more rural populations, in addition to the excellent ideas about, bringing it out to the communities, I think if you do a hybrid and have them come into a city, you've got to factor in travel expenses and overnight stays, a hotel, to make it worth someone's while to do that, because it really is a physical hardship, both the strain of the drive, but also how you feel after they take all the blood from you and run the tests.
Absolutely. I think those are very important considerations. So, as we come to a close, we've had so much wonderful information that you've shared, and I hope everybody was writing these down and is, reconstructing their trials and rethinking their approach to the regulatory process. But I wanted to ask each of you, maybe starting with Bruce and then Suzanne, and giving Wayne the last word, or perhaps penultimate before my own. What is the most important takeaway? What do you most want, particularly our friends at FDA, to understand better after today?
Well, I think one of the big things is better understand the variety of liver diseases, the variety of symptoms. Not everybody experiences the same symptoms. We need things to treat the actual disease, not the symptoms. I mean, that's fine, but we need the actual causes taken care of. Again, I'm going to kind of go off here for a second. One thing that we haven't discussed It's not really related to clinical trials, but it's to the overall thing is insurance.
Mhm.
That is also a big impediment to the diagnosing and treatment of liver disease overall. Because if you don't have the proper ICD code, you don't have the proper diagnostic codes and so forth. Even if a doctor wanted to order a test, they may not be able to, because if they don't have the right code, insurance is not going to pay for it. So I think that's another thing the FDA needs to get involved in, is have some mechanism to be able to get tests or whatever approved on an easier basis, so that we can get these tests done, instead of doctors saying, well, no, I can't do this. I'd love to be able to help you out to find out what's causing your disease, but I can't do it because insurance isn't going to pay for it, because Medicare or insurance has not approved it.
Well, we certainly want to, make sure we only give FDA tasks that are within their scope and their regulatory authority. But we'll have time to talk with other agencies after this. But I do think that certainly dialogue between FDA and their colleagues at CMS is very important. So that's something that has been, gone through the very rigorous process at FDA and has been indicated for NASH or another liver disease. We want to make sure that it is reimbursed by CMS. And so all of those parts need to work together to have meaningful access. And that does include in the ICD-10 process that works with CMS and others. And so your points are well taken, but to our friends at FDA, we do understand what is within your extensive scope and the big job that you have to do. And we will curtail our remarks for that. So Suzanne, what is the one takeaway?
Okay, I'm going to cheat. There are two, but I'll be succinct.
Okay.
One is no liver biopsy is a precondition for NASH trials. And two, provide patients at the end of the trial with the results of the testing of the liver. And if it is more than 6 months, then to do it every 6 months, where they get some sort of imaging that shows where they are, and any other blood work that would show what the results of that drug was on their system.
I think both were very important points. And so Wayne, what would you like? I won't even put a number on it. What would you like FDA to know after this?
Well, I really, really would like FDA to not be as distant as they are. It's taken us a year to put this little program together. We don't have much opportunity to engage in a way that is a dialogue. I mean, we're here talking at you, and we hope you're out there listening, and we don't know really whether you are. And if you're going to engage the patient community, engagement is more than us just giving a speech now and then and telling our story and you going off and maybe talk about it or whatever it is you do. But if you want to engage us in your processes, then you need to engage us and not just speak to us in the form of congressional testimony kinds of settings. So I'd like to see, more intimate engagement with FDA.
So I do appreciate Dr. Turner in the chat function. He is listening, but your points, Wayne, about the great desire for a regular dialogue on a more informal, more personable basis, as appropriate and within, regulatory provisions is something that we very much want. The other point, particularly about the differences between patient time and regulatory time, I think is one that we need to emphasize over and over again. As someone who progressed from diagnosis to almost death in under 2 years, just this time alone, since we started talking about, within our community about a PFDD meeting to, this day, there have been patients who have died. There are patients who have progressed from early stage NASH to advanced, who have progressed to cancer, who have progressed in this time to transplantation. And we know there are not enough organs for people to be transplanted. And so that urgency that we all feel as patients and caregivers cannot be overstated. And if we can make regulatory time a little closer to patient time, I think that would serve everyone. So allow me to thank this panel. Thank you, Bruce, Suzanne, Wayne, and I will provide just a little
Froze.
We've lost our leader here.
Yeah, her screen froze.
oh, am I here?
You're back.
You are now.
Okay, thank you. We're almost there, so let's keep the connection until then. So I just thanked Bruce, Suzanne, and Wayne, and I'll give some concluding remarks. I want to thank Dr. Turner. I want to thank our everyone from FDA, from whatever division or department that you are listening from. For staying with us throughout this day. I want to thank certainly all of our panelists, all of the patients and caregivers who contributed to informing the panelists' thoughts and who are counting on us to advance towards treatments for NASH. And as Bruce says, not just the symptoms, but the disease itself. I want to thank everyone who is researching in the space of NASH. It wasn't too long ago that there was very little research in liver diseases. And so we notice and appreciate that. We appreciate those who invest in that research, and thank you. I appreciate all of the Liver Action Network members, some of whom have participated as panelists and in the chat feature and in questions. Thank all of our NASH Council members, those academic centers, associations, medical societies who contribute to our work, whether it is this session today, our Language of NASH, our International NASH Day, or our US NASH Action Plan, which I encourage everyone to read and review to understand all the steps that any stakeholder can take to contribute to this work. And I certainly thank Team GLI for all of your excellence in making this possible. I thank you as the leader, but I thank you even more as a patient for everything you do. So the follow-up to this time today will be a report that will include the survey results. There is still a time and opportunity, if you haven't had a chance as a NASH patient or caregiver, to participate in that survey. So we hope that everybody who has been part of today will share it again through their networks, now that you perhaps understand the full importance and weight of what we are doing with this opportunity to help NASH drug development become more patient-centered. And so that report will be available around 30 days from now. It'll make a great present for the holidays. If you haven't already placed your order, it will be free in public and put out on all of our platforms. I want to thank and just sort of summarize the issues that we have raised about the seriousness of NASH, the urgency of NASH, the progressiveness of NASH, the diversity of ages and walks of life and types of people and patients that are affected by this disease. I want to underscore the points that were raised about the limitations and risks of biopsies and the evolution of non-invasive diagnostics and the role that they should play in both research and clinical practice. And I want to also really underscore the clarity with which patients participating today discussed the risks that they were willing to take to be able to have a treatment for the disease, and the fact that it is our risk to take. I thank everybody today. I thank everybody for their support, for true patient engagement, for patient-centered drug development, and I wish you the best of liver health. Good afternoon.